Hello, my name is Nicholas Felton. I'm an information designer based in New York City. This week, I'll be talking about the data visualization that I do for myself and the products that I build that comes out of that and how this can impact the world. I would like people to take away from my presentation a new sense of how data visualization is a new medium of communication similar to photography.
Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in Thailand, and I'm excited to share my work with you. My name's Nicholas Felton. You might know me as Feltron. This is the name under which I've created most of my work, and it's also where you can find me on Twitter and my website and all those, the regular places. I am originally from California, but my studio is in New York City. And I tend to make little companies to build different products or do work on my own for clients or just build products that I want to see in the world. I call myself an information designer. I was trained formally as a graphic designer, but all my products are based on using data as their primary material. I say a lot that data is the new wood. It is this creative material that we can use to build products, or we can use to build experiences, or simply graphic compositions. And so an example of this is these wine labels that I made for a company in Australia. And they wanted, to have a beautiful label, but they also wanted to tell the story of the grapes involved, which ultimately talk about the wine that is produced. So each of these different labels here is telling a different story about the unique conditions and like temperature or rainfall that went into the grape growing season, or the pH or the sugar balance in the grapes that went into making it. And so all these varietals and these variables go into making something that I think is informative both for new drinkers of wine or people who've just discovered this grower, as well as people who are experts who want to know more about what's going into this wine. And of course, the ultimate experience is tasting the wine, but this informs that experience. And I'm going to be talking a lot about data in this hour. And, as graphic designers, pretty much everything we work with is data. Photographs are now data, and text is data. I want to just clarify that when I talk about data, I'm talking about something that you might find in a spreadsheet or something you find in a database. And these are the things that I'm both coming up with ways of collecting and of ways of visualizing. And so a lot of the things that I produce are products for capturing data. This is something that in my work, I'm trying to empower people to understand themselves and to express themselves. And so I'll be talking a bit about these apps. An example here is Reporter. This is the most recent one I released, and I'll talk a bit more in depth about it later on. And then finally, I'm building experiences that are based on data, and this is another project that's using a very large data set about how people use the community's bicycles in New York City to get around. So I'm building products based on data at all these different levels, ones that are for me, ones that are for you, and ones that are for the broader community. But I want to talk about the state of data visualization as well in this talk. And so for those of you that don't have a good grasp on what data visualization is, I think Edward Tufte, who's written some great books on the subject, has qualified it as the visual display of quantified information. So instead of talking about numbers as 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s, we're talking about them in graphic terms. So one circle instead of the number 1. An example of that is this isotype illustration on the left. This is a technique that's popular now in infographics, but was pioneered in the 20s and 30s in Europe. And so this is on the left. This is information about men getting married in Germany in a year, and they're just substituting this one mark of a couple for 100,000 marriages. But on the right, you can fast forward to today, and we're still using marks to display quantified information. But in this case, each one of these points that's drawing a map of New York City is one Twitter mention or one Flickr photo. And you can see the kind of detail that we're working with now, this real change in the quality and quantity of information that we have. And so this is the type of work that I do. On the left, you can see this is the underlying information that might go into one of my graphics. And on the right is the outcome. So I'm building these systems that can translate from the spreadsheet, from the database, into something much more visual. And the beauty of this is how our brain works. Our brain does not look at a spreadsheet and inherently understand it, but our brain can pick out the subtleties from this map and start to understand the patterns involved. And so in a way, data visualization is very much like photography. Photography came into being around 1826. This is why it looks like a Star Destroyer from Star Wars, but this is actually just a shot out of a window, and this is widely considered to be the first photograph. So keep that number in mind. This is 1826. But when I say data visualization, you don't think 19th century or 18th century, but in fact, this is one of the first line graphs in existence. This is from what does it say? 1766. It's by William Playfair. William Playfair was this incredible man who invented the pie chart, the bar graph, and the line graph. And so this is, 60 years before photography was invented. So it has this historical precedence. This is an old medium now. And this is a quote by William Playfair that you could expect to read today, that as knowledge increases amongst mankind and transactions multiply, it becomes more and more desirable to abbreviate and facilitate the modes of conveying information from one person to another and from one individual to the many. This was true in 1726. Think how true it is now. So this is an incredible insight into where the world was going, and he was a great polymath who had this insight. So he was using it primarily in an economic context. So this is part of the book in which these bar charts were unveiled to the world, and they were simply fulfilling a need that he saw, that was to represent these quantities as visual entities and not as tables as had been done historically. We can also go back to how data's been applied to maps. This is a really famous map by John Snow that is how we discovered that cholera was transmitted through water supplies. So he had the insight that by mapping cholera incidents in his neighborhood, or this neighborhood that was afflicted by cholera, you could start to figure out, it's the houses by the well that have the most cases of cholera, and so perhaps it's coming from the well. And this is one of my favorite examples. This is from 1861. This painting shows Abraham Lincoln, and I believe this scene is the first time that the Emancipation Proclamation was read. So in American history, that's the document that freed the slaves. And in the corner down here, let me point it out, over there, and over there, there's this map. And this map is one that apparently, it was made by the precursor of the Coast Guard in the United States. And it's based on the 1860 census, showing the number of slaves, or the enslaved population per county in the states of the South in the United States. And so Abraham Lincoln pored over this, and he realized that this density, these black areas that are showing high concentrations of slavery, these are going to indicate which states are most likely to want to secede from the Union, and which would probably not be that reluctant. So this is an example of how data visualization in 1860 was primary in determining policy and informing a president as to how to proceed in terms of America's history. So what's different now? Manuel Lima, who is an incredible voice in data visualization, says, recently, data visualization has been a practice fueled by the advent of statistical thinking, and in the 19th century and the dawn of computers and the internet in the 20th century. Given the recent surge of interest in the field, it's tempting to contemplate information visualization as an entirely new discipline rising to meet the demands of the 21st century. So just talking about how we think of it as this new thing, but it's extremely old. And I think this can be said for some of the trends we see in photography. So we think of the selfie as this new affliction, this thing that Instagram has brought into our lives, when in fact you can go back, through the history of photography and see selfies showing up. This is not a new thing. And if you look at the data that applies to photography and the data that's fueling data visualization, you see these exact same exponential curves. I mean, this is the hallmark of this century, is everything's up and steeply to the right. But I love that we're in an age of big photo and also in this age of big data. And you can find this through numerous ways of plotting storage or cameras that are being sold. And I think what's amazing is that probably everyone in this room has the best camera they've ever owned in their pocket right now. So, photography is incredibly primary to our time, but what's been smuggled into these devices, along with an internet browser and the best communication device we have, is this whole bank of sensors that's talking about where we go, our heartbeats now, our physical activity is all being tracked by these devices, and in fact by these cameras. And so this kind of brings photography and data visualization back into parity with each other, because if you think of the history of photography, it started out being immensely personal. The first and primary use for it was to have portraits made. So photography is inherently about people. It's about us, it's about ourselves, it's about representation. I think data is only just coming to this point because of the personalization of these devices and how they're starting to describe our lives in really intimate terms. So on the right here, you can see this map. This is a GPS map of someone who lives in Portland. This is an intimate portrait of his life as told by data. And this is both the power and, it's the challenge of working in this medium, because it is so precise and it is so revealing about people's habits. And this is what I've been exploring for the past 10 years. Here's just another example of how these things are converging. This is a look at flights, both in a photographic sense and in a data sense. On the left, we have a long exposure photograph, whereas on the right, we have a photograph that we couldn't actually take in real life, but using data, we can talk about all the flights that crisscross America. So this first chapter, Data and Me, this is about this project I've been making for the past 10 years. I call these things personal annual reports, or more specifically, the Felton annual report. And these are these printed documents. They use statistics, they use maps, and they use charts to talk about what a year of my life looks like. And this is a project that I started sort of incidentally, but has come to encompass all these different aspects of my life. The activities that I do, the things I wear, conversations I have with people, my food and drink habits, where I go, media that I consume, my mood, photographs I take, social connections, or who my friends are and who I spend time with, the tools I use and how I get around. Pretty much everything that I could think about, I've tried to track in one year or another. And so I'll show you some of the ways that these have, I've asked different questions about my life, and I've tried to visualize those and what stories have come out of this. So 2005 is the first year in which I tackled this project, and it was not really an intentional approach. It was simply that I'd reached the end of the year. I thought it was an interesting year, and I wanted to encapsulate it and share it with my friends and family. So I started looking around. One of the things that happens when you have any data project is you have to ask yourself, first of all, what's the story that I want to tell here? But second, is the story that I want to tell, has it happened yet, or is it going to happen? If it has happened, then you're dealing with this archaeological process of looking back and trying to access data that describes the story you want. If you're looking forwards, then you're developing systems for capturing data. What is the methodology? How are you going to record this so that you can work with it later? And so in this case, I'd reached the end of the year, and I wanted to look back on it. So I had some tools at my disposal. I had the photographs I'd taken, my calendar, and a service called Last.fm. This was, it still exists, and I just started to use it in 2005. It was a way of recording all the songs that I listened to over the course of the year. And for me, this was fantastic. This described a portion of my life that I'm really passionate about in very great detail. So it inspired me to look to other aspects of my life and to do work to try and extract detail from these aspects to start to tell the story about my year. So this is one little sample. This is my year in photography. And I had to go through, I had to count up where the photos were taken. I was comparing digital to analog photos, and I was even doing a little content analysis. So this pie chart in the corner is where I've looked through my photos, and I've been able to deduce that 1% of my photos have a cat in them. So I put that report online, and it took on a life of itself. Of its own. I thought it would only be appealing to friends and family, and yet I started getting emails from people who said, this is amazing, I want to do it for myself, and if you get a good idea or people respond to it in this way, you have to hang on to it. So I decided the next year I would do it, but it would be bigger and better. I would record more information, and I would make it a printed piece. So these are the spreads from 2006. You can see the densities improved, and that's the result of spending more time on it and having more data that describes my life. This is one example of some of the detail that I went through to capture my life. So for every meal, I wrote down what animal I was eating, if there was meat in it. And now I've just ordered them into a taxonomy of how I think the world of meat should be described. It's a very simple approach to visualization. It's just a histogram, but allowing typography to do the job for me. And as I said, I made this a printed piece, and I did not have much of a following back then, but I said if anybody should happen to want a copy of this document I've made, just send me your address and I'll mail you a copy. And it wound up going to 27 different countries and 36 states, so I made an annual report to describe this distribution of the report. And so it's starting to snowball. I'm realizing that I have lots of ideas that I want to capture, and it's also becoming this great research and development project that's driving business to me as a graphic designer. So in 2007, I realized, foolishly, I'd neglected to capture the coffee that I drank in that year. And I was also interested in much more detailed location information. So without a GPS device, without a modern smartphone that's tracking our location, I simply wrote down the streets that I walked on in New York City. That means like turning left on Broadway and turning right on Canal, and then compiling this into a map, just drawing it in Illustrator at the end of each day. But here I can see these patterns in this portrait of myself and my behavior that matches my expectations. As for coffee, it's great to have a big number. So by saying this was a cappuccino and this was an espresso, I can add it up into how many milligrams. But what I really like is that I figured out this is almost 7 lethal doses of caffeine spread out across the year. In 2008, I decided I'd gotten as much detail out of this general approach as I was going to. And what would be interesting to do is to start looking at my life in more specific terms. And one of the things I thought would be impressive to do is to reduce my life down to just one number that I felt was indicative of the year. Maybe I couldn't recognize myself in it, but it would be unique to me. And the methodology I came up with is I would like to know how many miles I travel in a year, not just how many miles I run or walk, but all of them, the flights, everything. And by doing this, I felt like I could account for every day and every day's uniqueness, be it a sick day where I don't go very far, or the routine day where I just have my normal commute, my normal lunch, or a vacation day where I travel 10,000 miles to some distant country. And so for me, this added up to over 38,000 miles. And in fact, I was playing a video game in that year that had this incredible detail to it that gave me statistics about how many miles I traveled in that year. So by looking at the video game Grand Theft Auto, I could even add in a couple more miles. It didn't happen in the real world, but they were part of this journey of the year. And to try and humanize that in the same way that I did for the milligrams of coffee, if you average this out, I can say that in that year I was traveling at an average speed of 4.4 miles an hour. That attempt of capturing mileage was a little bit of a way of trying to find an easier way out because these reports were getting harder and harder. But I liked the data so much that I went into a great amount of detail in it. For 2009, I decided I don't want to wear a pedometer anymore. I don't want to account for all the streets that I walk down. I'm going to make other people do the work. So I printed these cards, and if I had what I considered to be a significant encounter with you, I would give you a card, and then the idea was you go to my website and fill out a survey and talk about what I did and where I was, and that way I could use that data. And maybe it doesn't even matter what I think we talked about or what we did. If someone else doesn't remember it, maybe it never happened. And one of the key things I was going after here is an analysis of my moods. I've always felt that I've been terrible at self-reporting this. So if I ask other people what my moods are, maybe I could get at some detailed understanding of that behavior. These are some of the responses. This is only going to about C through the alphabetical listing of them. And what happened was I got this great data, although this is what we consider to be unstructured data. There's nothing numeric about this yet. They're not really entities. And what I wanted to do was turn this into something that could describe my year in terms of how happy or sad I was and how introverted or extroverted I might be. So I started going through, the smiley emoticon is very obvious, that's completely smiley. But you get to more ambiguous terms in here, like beery or bored. And I don't really know where to put those, and I also don't want to interject myself back into this data set. I want a way of translating it into quantified amounts that I can work with without interjecting myself. So I decided to use this tool called Amazon's Mechanical Turk. This is still, in play, and it's a place where you can have people do really simple tasks for a couple of pennies. And so I asked these Turk workers to rate all these words on a scale of happy to sad or introverted to extroverted, and it worked incredibly. And this is what's amazing about it. Now I have this document that describes myself, this data set that talks about my behavior, and I was able to ask, other people in the world to describe it for me. And I love how some of these terms came out. There's really interesting ones like, depending on how you spell this word buoyant, you get different ratings. So, I also like how alcohol plays into it. Like, if you're boozed, it's slightly positive, but if you're beery, it's slightly negative. So stick with booze, I guess. And this gave me exactly what I wanted. I could now plot my mood over time. I could get to what I really wanted to know, which is, what's my average mood? Because I always think I'm just okay, and it turns out, well, I'm actually just swell, which is pretty much the same thing, or about 74% happy if you're going to quantify it. In 2010, I shifted gears a little bit. So I lost my father in this year, and he led a very long and great life. but I didn't show up in his life until it was more than halfway done. He was nearly 50 when I was born. So he had this entire stretch of existence. It was really, much more interesting before I showed up than after I showed up. He was born in Berlin prior to World War II and had to flee to escape the Nazis. And it's certainly a history that needs to be preserved, and one that I wanted to express and explore. So in going through all his stuff with my sister, we discovered all these really data-rich items. These are things like his calendars, slides, postcards, passports going back about 50 years. And as I've shown before, I'm willing to do the hard work to get to novel stories. I'm willing to go through this and copy down all the text in his calendars and pore over his passports and extract the data from them. And that's exactly what I did. Here you can see an example of a calendar from the 1980s when we were traveling together. And after I went through it and I tagged all the entries. I could see that mentions of work were going down over time in the 80s, and mentions of his children and of travel were going up. And this really matched with my recollection of this time with him. He'd gone into retirement and he was spending more time with his children. So this approach was playing out. And so I started to apply it in other places, like using passports, which have both the address where he could be found and a postmark on it that tells you the date. So using that, I could put all these addresses into both spatial and temporal locations and connect them and talk about how he moved around in the Bay Area in California from the 1960s until his death. Using passports, I could go through there and kind of do the same thing on a global level. So talk about the places that he went through time from the 1960s until the present. And photos were this really rich source of information as well. And I can bunch them into a couple of different categories. So on the left, this is something that has personal context for me. You don't know what this photo is, but I recognize my parents and I recognize the house in which I was born. On the right, we might all recognize this, and so I can place this in space as well. Then there are these sets of photos that are just kind of unknowable, at least unknowable for the moment. But the most interesting set are these ones, which I don't recognize but are discernible. So using the tools that we have now, you can do something like type in the text from this gravestone and get to the Wikipedia entry, or go to Google image search, and by typing in Dijon, as seen in that little detail on the right, figure out that this is a square that has hardly changed in 40 or 50 years in Dijon, France. So I can start to place these as well in space. And when I was done with that process, I wound up with hundreds of points where I could locate my father on the planet. And by using this triangulation method, you can see the outlines of continents start to emerge. This technique also kind of describes them in detail. So the more points you have, the more detail emerges, like in Europe or on the West Coast. And finally, when I was opening one of his drawers, I found this little rolled up piece of paper in it, and it had his name on it, and it's a date in 1974. And I had no idea what it was going to be. And I unfurled it, and it's this record of his heartbeat. I'm trying to take all these things that aren't graphs and turn them into graphs. And in fact, I was able to find, the graph that describes his life, his essence, in his drawer. So in addition to all the other charts and graphs I was making about him, I had to incorporate this one that is, a little preservation of his heartbeat. And this was, it was very therapeutic for me as well in dealing with my father's passing. But it was the first time that I learned that data visualization can be this really moving experience for people. I heard from people who'd never met him, who read to the end and said, they were either on the cusp of tears or they cried when they read it. And to see, the power of this, or giving it to his 70 and 80-year-old friends who did not grow up digesting data visualization, and for them to immediately get it and start to see him in it. That was really inspiring and really helped push me to understand the breadth of this medium. I wound up doing an annual report about 2 years in 2011 because I'd set out to track some things in the year that my father died and just continued on with it. And what was interesting about this is, unlike previous years, I now had 2 data sets that were exactly the same, describing 2 different years, and I could start to compare and contrast them. And one of the ways that this works graphically is that I've encoded 2010 in the blue color and 2011 in the pink color. And basically, all throughout the document where these colors are used, whether it's alone or if they're mixed together, it's telling you a bit about the relationship between the 2 years. So if you see like a pink pie chart here, it means this was stuff that mainly happened in 2011. Or a mainly blue pie chart is stuff that mainly happened in 2010. And this applies to things like the maps as well. Points are marked in blue or cyan or magenta, and they're also allowed to mix. So purple is the times when things happened in both years. And what I was trying to get at in this year was how our personalities change based on who we're with. There's the aggregate version of myself that I've portrayed in prior years, but then there's the version of me that exists with my girlfriend or with my mom or with my work partner. And how does that change? And this taught me a lot about relationships. In fact, for me, I realized, you know what? Apart from the 2 or 3 people that you see a lot, everyone else is long tail. These are people that you only see a couple of times a year, apart from your coworkers. Unfortunately, this is the dirty secret behind all of this. Up to this point, I was recording almost everything in my calendar. And when you start to record every place that you're going, everything you're eating and drinking, and all the people you spend time with, it gets really messy, and it's a lot of hard work. So in 2012, I set out to find a better way of doing this. And what I wound up developing is this app called Reporter. I'd really wanted a way of not having to record everything, but of using a system of random alerts or random notifications to just cue me to fill out a survey. And I thought maybe there would be a medical device out in the world, like a band or an alarm clock or something that I could use, and then I would, fill out a survey in a spreadsheet or something along those lines. And I never found that device. And then I realized in 2011 that, the iPhone is this programmable computer. It can do whatever I want it to. And even better than that, it's got all these sensors attached. It's connected to the internet, so I can save off the data and not have to worry about losing or breaking the device. And so I started writing up the specs for this app, what I wanted it to do. And I sent it to a friend and said, what do you think? Like, is this possible? Is this written out well? And to my surprise, he said, I'll build it for you, which is why this is a very bare bones, hideous interface, undesigned thing, but it got the job done. I had it set to go off, I think, about 16 times over the course of the day. I figured out that approximately every 90 minutes was far enough from the previous time I was answering a survey that I was doing something different, but not infrequent enough that it didn't capture most things. So you can see the main screens here. There's this initial one that has the survey interface, and then little buttons that just say whether it's captured some metadata like location or time, place, ambient audio, apps that are running on the phone, and how many photos I've taken since the last report. And so all those will fill in black, and then I go through the survey, talk about where I am, what I'm doing, who I'm with, what I'm wearing, what tools I'm using, what I'm eating or drinking. And some of these are questions that would just be impossible to answer on an ongoing basis, like having to write down what clothes you're wearing every time you take on a piece of clothing or take off a piece of clothing would be really tedious. But by just answering it a couple times a day and having it pre-fill your previous answer, you can get through it really, really quickly. I thought tools was something that was really interesting to get at, like how much time do I actually spend using my phone or using the computer, or what apps do I use? I would not want to have to fill this out all the time, but here you can see the distribution of these reports. And you can see the kind of stochastic distribution of them and how they really describe the entire year. The white bars represent times when I was asleep. And it also allowed me to get this really good grasp on who I spend time with. So this is a network diagram showing a couple of important clusters, this being New York friends and this being coworkers at Facebook, as I was working there at the time. And then a little bit of sort of the people who are in between, who socialize with both of them. But again, this really detailed rendering of my social life that I don't think I could get at any other way. In 2013, I was interested in looking at communication. This is, is a defining element of our society, of our humanness, is being able to communicate. And so I set up the shopping list of things that I wanted to get. I wanted to get mainly the means of communication that I rely on the most. So these are things like digital communications, email, SMS, and chat. And then the other ones that we consider traditional means of communication, like the post office, things we get in the mail, conversation face-to-face, and using the phone. And I realized that there were two types of information I wanted to get out of this. There's the metadata. This is the stuff that's going to describe when something happens, who it's with, sometimes where it happened. And then there's the data. This is the payload of this communication, what we actually talked about. And some of this I could get for free. In all these digital mediums, I didn't have to change my behavior at all to get all of them at the end of the year. Versus things like capturing phone calls and mail and conversation, I basically had to figure out a way of both generating the metadata for all of this and of capturing what the content was. So the hardest one, of course, is conversation, and this meant that I had to develop a survey system where I was filling out how I greeted someone, who it was, how long we talked for, and then writing a synopsis of the conversation. And the crazy thing that happened during this time is that I'll get back to that. This is a book, actually, that I made that contains all the conversation data. So in some ways, this is one of the most visceral visualizations of the data that I collected in this year. This is a 400-page book, and this is simply the conversation data. And this is, I think I was in China for this. These are like stewardesses that I talked about. No one's going to care that I'm sharing that communication data, but I don't want to show you anything too revealing, so I'm just going to flip through the book in this kind of blurry video. The idea here is just to give you a sense of what a year of conversation looks like. So it's kind of a Bible's worth of communication. And some of it, as you can see, there's long paragraphs in there, but most of it's really short, and it's everything from like waving to a driver who let me run past him when I'm running to weddings where I talk to 20 people. And so the crazy thing that happened in this year is that we had the NSA, Edward Snowden revelations, and you know what? The government also wanted all of this. And so there was this kind of weight on me to try to figure out, well, what is revealed in all this data? What is this saying about us? Because no one else has this information besides the NSA. So I kind of took this sort of anonymous bureaucratic tone of voice in making this document. And I think it also solidified a bunch of my thoughts about data privacy. So I'm not going to share intimate details in this, but I can show you things like this, which is like these are the locations at which I talk to baristas around the world over the course of the year. And I firmly believe that no one should know more about you than you know about yourself. So this is a statement about who is collecting information on you and whether you have access to it. And in the course of making these annual reports, I've realized that in order to know about myself, I wind up gathering all these other people into the fray. I think this is also evident in the way that the government has been collecting information on Americans and people around the world, is that in order to gather information on, a few ill-intentioned people, they wind up capturing everything. And so my Freedom of Information Act surrounding this data set and this project is, if you appear in it, you can email me and say, hey, Nicholas, I talked to you in 2013, I want my data out, and I will send you everything that's contained in it. So in analyzing this data set, I was looking at both the metadata and the data, and trying to figure out what said what about me. This is some of the visualizations that are part of it, talking about when things happen. These are content-specific buckets, like how many people did I SMS with, how many people did I email with. And one of the things I realized is that while we get these assurances from the government that metadata, is being collected and we shouldn't worry about it, I wound up finding out that that's one of the most revealing aspects of this data set. If you plot out your SMS, as I did here, each little speck representing one message, with January being on top and December being on the bottom, and then midnight on the left and midnight on the right, there are all these features of this static that start to talk about my life. So you can see when I'm asleep, all these dark parts are when I'm asleep. I can receive messages, but I can't send them when I'm asleep. You can see little shifts. These talk about when I'm traveling, so my time zones have changed here. And then traveling with my girlfriend, who's the person that I message the most, you get these blank spots. So there's social context in this as well. So you can tell where I am, who I'm with, when I'm asleep. It's very intimate stuff, and you're not even getting into what those messages are about. So metadata does matter. And in fact, I found out through doing this, it's even more valuable than the payload itself, because the payload is so confusing. You have no idea who's being talked about. There are all these misinterpretations of it that are so easy. And so the document goes from this very high-level metadata analysis to the more intimate stuff, like who I hugged and the etiquette that I used. So 2014, this is the 10th report. This is the final one in this experiment. They're taking too long to make, and I feel like the journey is starting to be complete. I decided in 2014 I wanted to use sensors. I wanted to use this world of devices and apps that are available to all of us. All these things that didn't exist 10 years ago when I started this. So my intention was to instrument myself as well as possible. So on my phone, I'm adding an app like Moves to track everywhere that I go and my activity. I have a specific one for skiing. When I go skiing, I use ski tracks. The camera roll, things I'm taking photos of, these are marking moments of importance. They're also marking time and location. And Instagram, these are the moments of public sharing. Which moments have significance to them. In addition, I had to instrument my laptop. So I'm still using Last.fm to talk about the music that I listen to, but I've added an app called Rescue Time, and this will keep track of the apps that I'm using, the websites that I visit, and also Netflix will keep track of the things that I watch. And then, how do you start to talk about these other things that aren't on the devices? So one is a watch that I've been wearing called Basis, and this is identifying physical activities like walking, running, and cycling. It's also capturing my heart rate. It can tell me when I sleep, the number of steps that I accumulate each day. This is one of my favorites. This is called the Lapka blood alcohol monitor. It's this little ceramic cylinder, and every time you've been drinking, you blow through it, and you look on your phone in the app, and it tells you what your blood alcohol is. And the amazing relationship I had with this device is that it trained me to know what my blood alcohol is. This is a statistic about us that can send you to jail that most people have no way of understanding. And I got to a point with this where I would know, I'm going to be at 0.03, I'm going to be at 0.04, and I blow on it. Yep, there I am. My car, I instrumented with the automatic sensor. If you've been paying attention, this is the second time this image has appeared today. And this is giving me location and driving stats, like when I accelerate too quickly or brake too hard. I think this is the final thing. Just a networked scale. So this is keeping track of my weight and body fat. And all these things are tied together, like blood alcohol, steps, weight. They're starting to create this little network of interconnected data that's describing me in high detail. And so this was my kind of matrix of all the things that I deployed to try and track myself. So the yellow ones are ones that I'm actually exploiting the data set. I'm using these in the report. And I always have to call out Amazon, their Kindle. These are, I think this would be one of the most interesting data sets, and Amazon locks it up so that no one can get to it. And so I have to just shake my fist at these people. They know more about me than I know about myself, and that's not okay. And so I'm getting to this like minute-to-minute granularity. This is starting to look at some of these data sets over time, like sleep versus running, and you can see these patterns starting to emerge. But this is like a precision that I've never had before, talking about my behavior. And it's also this type of portraiture that's really intimate. So these are, obviously photos of me. They're externally identifiable. But this is a portrait of me as well. This is a picture of me that's not immediately recognizable. But when you start to do something like this, put all these points on a map, this is now a portrait of me that is so intimate that I recognize myself, but you don't recognize me. When I see this, I see my home here. I see, my running routes up in Greenpoint. I see my office here. I can even see, down to like the half marathon that I ran. I can see all these different moments of my life. And I think that's the beauty of working with personal data, is that it supports the decisions you make. You know this data set, and if you do things right, you can see yourself, and it means that you can also push things further. So when I take a map and I turn it into this sort of networked blobby fingerprint, if I still recognize myself in it, I know that the technique that I've developed is working well. And it doesn't matter if you don't recognize yourself in me, because now this is an expressive tool. This is me sharing with you what I am like. So some of the products that I've made started with Datum. This came directly out of this annual report project in 2008. And the idea was, initially, we should just take some of these visualizations and apply them to data sets that people have. But it evolved over time, and it became more about giving people a really easy way to record data stories that they were interested in. So simply recording an item like Coca-Cola and the time it happened, if you're interested in tracking that sort of stuff. A lot of people wanted to track reading or movies or studying for school. And so we gave you these easy tools in order to record this data and then to visualize it and express yourself to other people. So a menu of different visualizations and tools for setting up, well, what time range do you want to show? Do you want to show averages? Do you want to show a pie chart? And then control over this data. So this is the kind of ledger. This is where everything lives, where you can edit them or delete them or say this is a private item or not a private item. And this led directly into working at Facebook in 2011. This is kind of the combination of the work that I'd done on my dad's annual report, which is talking about an entire life and turning data into this narrative, as well as the work with Datum and creating a tool for people to express themselves through data. Facebook had a couple of problems in 2011. And they'd already decided they were going to make Timeline, but their problems were specifically there was this issue of privacy through obscurity, where old things you'd done on the site were no longer accessible. You couldn't scroll down on your profile far enough to actually see them, but they existed. It's possible that someone with a better computer or a better internet connection might see these things about you, but you couldn't see them or control them. They were also introducing a way of pumping in data from other services that was going to become a part of your profile. And so a lot of the work was in figuring out, how do you navigate time? How do you make this interface reflect our memories and the way that we think about ourselves? And also, how can the surface incorporate data that's coming from these other places? So this is some of the music stuff, and you can see that there's a bit of datum that lives on in the activity log here, which is where you control, and you can see all the data that's being used to make this portrait of yourself. And the final project I did at Facebook, again, ties back to datum, which I love. This is, rather than the major life events that go with timeline, like I got married or I had a kid, with this action tagging, you can say, I read a book, or I ate a sandwich, or I had a beer. These are the kind of small activities that can add up to this big portrait of your life and kind of create these full thoughts now. So you can say, like, I'm with a person doing this thing at this place, which I think is interesting. And I was also proud of some of the sort of the graphic changes that I was able to make there, like pushing through new styling for the maps that they use, as well as introducing Helvetica into the typographic palette. So Reporter, this is the production version of the app that I developed for the 2012 annual report. Like I said, it worked so well, it required so little effort and gave me this really high quality data. So the key here was in turning that interface that only I understood into something that other people could grasp, allowing them to customize the questions, and to get a little bit of a visualization back out of it. So the process is, you get this notification that says it's time to report, you don't know when it's going to happen, and then you fill out the survey you've set up. It might be, who am I with, or where am I, or what's my mood, or how many coffees have I had? And then you get these visualizations. I'm pretty proud of our data policy. We have no servers of any type, so the data is only local to the device. So if anybody hacks us, there's nothing to hack. If anyone comes knocking for the data, we just can't provide it. And what's cool is you can create this little personal API for yourself. So you can save all your reports to your Dropbox file and then do things like this. This is a guy who's built a website that's entirely based on his reports. So it's live and updating, and you can look at who he spends time with, where he's eating. There's a ton of transparency here. I would not do this. I choose to curate my data very heavily before I share it. But he's completely accountable to this stuff. And so I've been enjoying doing these bigger visualizations as well. I'll just share this one, which is called Bike Cycle, and this is using an entire community's worth of data. New York has these shared bikes that you can rent called City Bike, and City Bike has been nice enough to share the entire data set. So you can download, it's over 1 gigabyte of data that describes an entire year. So I got all of 2014's riding data, starting with the stations involved. So there's 322 stations. There's over 100,000 different possible routes between them, and there were over 8 million rides in 2014. And my commission was to use this data for this device called Framed. This is a screen with an embedded computer that you hang on the wall, and you can make artwork for it. And I chose to make what I consider to be a slow visualization. So because you live with this device, I don't have to express the entire depth and breadth of this data set in one moment. Instead, I decided to share it over the course of a year. So what you're looking at when you turn this thing on is where the bikes were in the system 1 year ago in 2014, at this very moment. So there's different scenes to it. These are all the riders on July 9th at 5:22 p.m. These were the most popular rides on that day. These are the stations and the ratio of people starting rides to stopping rides. I like this one a lot. This tells the story of just 2 bikes or sometimes 1 bike. It's the bikes that either had the most rides or the most mileage in the system. Sometimes it's 2 bikes and sometimes it's only 1, but of course it's different every single day, and you can't see it unless you visit it every single day. And then finally, a heat map showing those riders. And this is a little movie of it in action. The dots move very, very slowly. It's rare that you can see one that's moving, fast enough to really catch. And it just cycles through, I didn't play it. It just cycles through these different scenes. There we go. I think this is a little bit faster. It takes a minute in the real version to cycle through a complete scene. And then there's also some little stats at the bottom that talk about like the cumulative mileage and really interesting patterns that come out, especially between like the weekends and the weekdays. And they give you some really intimate data, like the ratio of different sexes that are riding the bikes, and the age of subscribers to the system. All right, so let's wrap this up. So where are we and what's happening? This is Grand Theft Auto, the latest version, because this is where I think we're headed. If you played video games 20 years ago, the only stats that you got were a high score. Today, everything that can be quantified in this world is being quantified. So, how far this guy rode on his bike, how fast he went, how far he jumped, his highest jump, his fastest moment. All this is being quantified in video games now, and we are headed directly to that point. So, anything that we can put sensors on, for better or worse, is getting a sensor, and that means it's getting a data stream. So, these are not the bad examples. I think it's pretty cool to put a sensor on your dog that tells you, how much he's exercising and how far he's going during the day. This one's a little bit more iffy. This is a Kickstarter project. It's a cup that tells you what you're drinking and, how much you're drinking and what's in the cup and how many calories it is. But like I said, these are the good examples. There's a lot of nonsense and, quite frankly, shit being made. And so I think when, if everything in the world can be measured, I think you should really think about, well, should it be measured? And I think, there's certainly like dystopian views of the future that are very easy to come up with when you think about everything being instrumented. But I think people tend to think in the more positive terms, at least in a business sense. So, having data leads to profit, it leads to convenience, and it leads to insight. But I think, these other sides really need to be considered. Especially, I think we're seeing more and more that, a business holding onto data can be just as easily a liability. It can lead to being hacked or lawsuits. Having data in your home could both be a convenience, but it can be a vulnerability. People's baby monitors are now being hacked. There was an audit of them which, showed the security was pretty much 100% shit on these devices. And if you're looking for insight, you might just wind up with more questions. So really considering, what data should be generated and stored and worked with, I think is something to consider. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is get from this data to some sort of understanding so that we can take action. I think, the business model of that is data to, I don't know, to making money, and you can fill in the blank with whatever. So I think machine learning is one of the big ways in which people are filling in the blank there to connect data to profit. And it's getting good, but it's also, kind of shitty as well. So this is Google's attempts at auto-captioning photos, and this one's really good. This is a group of young people playing a game of Frisbee, which is great, but on the right here, this says, a refrigerator filled with lots of food and drinks, which is, is not quite right, and which is the reason it can be hard to automate a lot of these really analog data sets, like natural language data sets, and looking at photos and trying to figure out what's going on in them to quantify them. Another way of looking at this data is to try and come up with correlations, and there's plenty of different algorithms for doing that. But ultimately, they don't tell you that much. Again, it's like a black box. So this is a true correlation from some of my data from 2014, that there's this medium strength negative correlation between my daily transit time and daily computing time. And I see this and I kind of glaze over, but when I see it plotted out, when I see it visualized, this gives me a very sort of guttural understanding of it. Here we have daily transit time, shortest on the left, longest on the right, and the amount of time I'm able to compute. And sure enough, right here, short transit time, lots of computing time. So if we want to get past the insights to really understanding things, I think visualization is the way that we need to speak. And so I would much rather have this visual representation of how healthy my my food is to having to look at tabular data, and I think William Playfair would agree. We're trying to reveal the invisible, and if you tell me it's going to rain, sometimes I want to know, exactly where that rain is, but a lot of times I just want to know that it's about to rain. And the beauty of where we are right now is that people are getting really good at making data visualization. The tools are getting really good, and the audience is getting very literate. If you look at the skills that are required to make this stuff, I kind of think there are 4 types of people involved, or one person who has all these 4 skills that can make amazing stuff. This is having design sensibility, being able to code, having the journalist's sort of curiosity and storytelling desires, and then a little bit of being a quant or a statistician to analyze this data. And so this is just some of the good stuff that is available to us now, like amazing online tools. New York Times has been doing incredible things, generating new forms using things like D3. This is a time map that's distorting the Netherlands to show how far it takes to travel different places. And this is one of the best ones from the 2012 election that was showing all these different paths that Obama had to the White House. In fact, they're getting so good. This is a visualization of wind in the United States. That the pilots started using this because it was better than the tools they had, and they had to put a disclaimer on it saying, don't use this for professional purposes. This is purely for entertainment. And so I think the future does not look like this. This is, the sort of Iron Man view of where everything is some crazy chart and graph. But I do think that, underneath the insights that we're looking for, like, you need to buy milk, or my average heart rate is 57, when we want to understand this, we do go a little deeper, and that's where data visualization is the true path, I think, to understanding data that we're generating in the world. So, thank you very much.
Which methodologies have you been using to gather the data and capture various forms of data, and how does it affect your daily life?
I think I've tried almost everything that I can think of to capture my behavior from, I guess there's 3 different techniques that I like to think of. There's that archaeological approach, which is going back in time, going back and looking at records of what happened. Then there's this kind of hoarding approach, which is I'm just going to record everything that I can as it happens. And then sampling, so either asking other people what I was doing, or using an app that I've developed to Reporter to quiz me. And then I think the final one that's kind of a subset of hoarding is this instrumenting approach, which is allowing technology to capture all my behavior. And then they all have different impacts on my life. So I'm trying to come up with approaches that are going to have the least impact, or are going to influence me to behave better, like go to new places, or in the communication one with tracking conversation, I wanted to remember people's names and remember my conversations better. But they also have negative impacts, like when I was capturing my conversations, there were times in which I just didn't want to pull out my phone and write something down. So if someone opened a door for me, I might just slip through and not say thank you, and contribute to the sort of bad reputation of New Yorkers. So I'm not proud of that, and I'm glad it's over. But typically it's like, try and come up with a system it's either going to have a neutral impact on my life or a slightly positive one. But sometimes the stories I want to get after just require that I go a little bit further into the negative territory.
During the peak time, how many hours would you say you spend documenting?
I sometimes I don't even want to think about it. For when I was tracking the conversation, it was at least an hour a day, if not maybe 2 sometimes. So I guess you can do the math on that. Yeah, many weeks were involved in capturing it.
What's the starting point for you of the fascination in the information? And the second one is, how do you make a jump from a graphic designer to an information designer? To my understanding, it's like a totally different spectrum, like a totally different thing. Yeah.
Was the question, how did I become a data designer?
Yeah,
Okay.
from graphic designer in bachelor degree.
Yeah. So the way that I became a data designer was basically just through this accidental process of creating this annual report. And to answer your first question, I think, I don't have, do you know what obsessive compulsive disorder is? So I don't have that, but I definitely have, I'll admit to having some obsessive qualities. So certainly like collecting things. I tend to start a lot of collections, and collecting data is kind of an easy, it's a nice collection to have because it doesn't take up much space. And then wanting to organize things neatly. So that's what I've done once I've hoarded all that data, is I'll start to organize it. And so simply the process of like enjoying the mental exercise of collecting this data. And I think that came out of a history of doing like travel journals. So when I would go someplace, I was very adamant about wanting to record it, be it like photographically or making a book about the journey. And so this is just an expansion of that idea, except for your journey is a year long rather than a week long. And as people started paying more attention to the annual reports, and I started investing more energy, people started coming to me and saying, mainly from magazines, saying, can you make this map look better? Can you make this graph look better? And I just thought it was kind of a typographic exercise at first. I was doing work that they didn't want to do. But then the project started to get better and better, and I realized that I really enjoyed this, and it was something that I could specialize in. So I decided I was going to just stop taking all other work unless it had to do with data. That was the way that I would get better the fastest. And so I think in 2007 or 2008, I strictly started doing data projects, and that's when it really took off. It's just like any feedback cycle. As soon as you start investing more energy into it, it ramps up. And I recommend it. So there is a huge need for designers in the world who are fluent in working with data. I don't know how many jobs I turn down and people say, well, who can you recommend? And I just have a list on my website that I point to people who are competent at doing this. And they tend to be swamped as well. So get into it.
As we can collect and store more data, how do you determine which matrix dimensions to use or types of charts, graphs, to ensure that you can visualize data in such a way that give valuable insight?
I think the first question I think is like, should that data be collected or not? Is the value that you can get out of it greater than the damage that it could potentially do by being recorded? And I think that's up for grabs. I think it may just be like a personal question that everyone has to answer for themselves, depending on their behavior. Like, for me, I think having my location data recorded all the time is much more of an asset to me than it is a liability. And then it just depends on what you want to get out of it. So what are the insights that you're looking for from this data? And there's probably a visualization that is the right fit for it, or something that can be invented. I showed near the end of it, a scatter plot that's just comparing, it was my computing time versus my transit time. And you can do that with anything, as long as they have a metric that they share, like time or amount, then you can start to make these charts that compare them. And that's when you can start to see, just visually, is there some sort of clustering here, or is it noisy and I'm not getting anything out of it? So, that's one of my passions, is developing tools for people, because Excel's not going to do all this for you. It's not going to clean up your data, and it's not going to give you all the different visualization options that you might want. So allowing people to have access to their data, ways of parsing it and visualizing it, and then ways of sharing it is a real priority, because I think people need to know themselves.